Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar about bridging the CISO gap, reporting, assurance and compliance amid increased regulatory demands. I'm your moderator, Keith Bovey, Director of Marketing at Panaseer, and I'm joined today with Simon Goldsmith, Enterprise Security and Platforms Lead at OVO Energy. Nice to meet you, Simon. How's it going?
Likewise, Keith. No, thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
Security Leaders Peer Report is something that Panaseer have been doing for 5 years now. It's a proprietary piece of annual research that we do to understand what's top of mind for security leaders. Findings have shown that 90% of security leaders believe they are being asked to give more assurances to the board. Increasingly, we're seeing growth in external threats, but also in internal pressures. There's now the added complexity of regulation, legislation, and public scrutiny that's demanding this from the CISOs and security leaders. And it's not just us saying it. Gartner have found in 2021 that 50% of CISOs now report directly to the board, so 4 years ago, and that was up 25% year on year from 2019. On the flip side, 2024 KPMG Global CEO Outlook survey found that 67% of CEOs noted that cybersecurity is now a top concern on their agenda. The CISO role has undoubtedly evolved from being purely technical to a much more strategic role, and it requires direct interaction with the board and a whole lot more eyeballs on it. And I'm sure you're feeling that, Simon, which leads us beautifully into the topic about board level scrutiny. 85% of CISOs believe that they are now facing greater board level scrutiny than ever before and are being asked to provide more assurances around controls on their security posture. So my first question to you, Simon, is how do you personally deliver that level of assurance and that level of communication to your board?
I think about it on kind of three levels in terms of the assurance piece. There's almost like to coin a phrase, the staying alive bit. So are we doing a good job of preparing for and responding to incidents and attacks? So I think that's the kind of the bare minimum, and providing some telemetry around how good a job are we doing of either detecting attacks or responding to them, and setting up our playbooks and having all of those kind of conversations in advance that you want to be prepared for, rather than kind of reacting to in the moment. The second level is more around what are we doing to detect problems or exposures. So whether those are vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, issues in our systems where we're providing opportunities to attackers, how good a job are we doing of detecting and generating signals of those generally to the asset owners who are in a position to fix them. And then the third level, which is really much more of the board level, which is around more strategically, how good a job are we doing of operating an information security management system, and essentially doing all the planning and the risk management and the risk treatment in terms of security controls. How well set up are we as a business to be doing that more strategically? Are we detecting control gaps? Are we planning control improvements in a well controlled and scheduled way, rather than just kind of running around and fixing problems as kind of attackers or regulators highlight them to us?
So the way you split it out into three levels there is really interesting. Do you find that any one level is hindering any other of the levels? They ideally work beautifully in tandem, but do you find the scrutiny, the reporting takes time away from the other two levels particularly?
It can do, and that's very kind of business dependent and sector dependent. If you've got a regulator that is very demanding from a compliance perspective, you are just going to spend more time looking at the evidence that you've got control coverage and effectiveness, rather than actually doing the control implementation and the risk reduction. So it's, I find that's varied by business, from business to business and from sector to sector. And financial services is obviously the sector that gets most of the headlines around regulatory, but increasingly other sectors are starting to see more on the regulatory front.
Is there any benefit from that increased scrutiny, or more scrutiny is probably a negative spin on it, but the increased dialogue that you're having with more senior members of your organization? Are you seeing benefits from those changes?
I think something that is worth bearing in mind is compliance is quite scalable. And you get this when you work in large organizations, and particularly global organizations, having a standard that business and technology teams have to comply to is a much more scalable thing than going around everywhere and saying, right, what are the threats, what are the risks that are arising from that threat landscape, and what are the controls that are best placed to mitigate those risks. That can be quite an involved exercise. I mean, there's tooling that can help with it all, but compliance it helps with scale and helps with, there's a reason why regulators and standards bodies kind of talk about raising, a rising tide raises all boats and that sort of thing. It's a way of doing that. But if the risk is, or the problem is if the compliance requirement isn't tailored to your business, it probably isn't doing the job of reducing risk that the regulator or whoever's setting the compliance standard hopes it is. So, and that can happen quite a lot in security because of the interplay between different business systems and controls. Control priorities can vary a fair bit across businesses and even within businesses.
And do you have any personal recommendations on how you might tackle that and how you might work with the board in your own experiences?
Really key for me is to form a really great working relationship with enterprise risk, particularly in larger organizations. You'll have an enterprise risk function it will be pretty mature at managing other types of risk to the business, and they've probably got a pretty decent idea on or an opinion at least around cybersecurity risk and regulatory risk, that's related to it. So I think that's kind of the first step for me is working out where enterprise risk are at and their view of the world, and then try and bridge that. And there is always a gap between enterprise risk's view of the world and the technology and the business teams who are building, buying, configuring kind of technology and services and the things that we're trying to secure. So I think that's kind of tends to be the starting point for me for that third layer that I talked about, the more kind of strategic planning aspect. From the kind of the more front line and the exposure management, it's really being specific around what controls are going to make the biggest difference to the type of asset that is being bought, built, or configured. So, the kind of controls that we'll prioritize for our cloud infrastructure, for example, versus the types of controls that we'll put around identity and access for both kind of SaaS and cloud. There's different priorities there and different conversations with the administrators of those systems.
We've mentioned regulation and compliance quite a few times in there. It's fair to say it looks like new and updated regulation is heading towards more accountability, more visibility of operational and digital resilience security controls. Is that something that you're feeling an impact in your everyday work in your industry?
I think it's business as usual for most of us that are in security, and that we're always trying to work out that accountability map, and something that I think is really important is felt accountability. So people really feel accountable for the security of the systems that they're building, buying, but don't feel kind of rabbit in the headlights because security are kind of just leaving them to it. So it's a bit of a combination of how do we help them build, buy, and configure securely, provide that kind of safety net of saying that we are going to operate, I don't know, bug bounty programs to kind of detect exposures that don't get picked up, or we are going to operate attack detection and response for you and run those centrally. So it's kind of just having really clear accountabilities and responsibilities for the different bits of security risk, and if there are regulatory requirements, just being super clear about how those are being dispersed in the business.
Yeah, it sounds to me like compliance for you and your approach to it is working at the moment, and you're executing in a meaningful way. You sound pragmatic, practical in your approach, and you have a system. Is there any sense that with increased regulation legislation, the EU's obviously trying its best to release various portions of it, the UK will always follow suit when it's a good idea, the US issued a whole load of executive orders, there's obviously more and more emphasis on that stuff. Do you feel like there's a change coming in how compliance is executed more broadly? Because it's that obviously in your world, particularly OVO Energy, you would imagine compliance and audit is front and center, but broadly it feels like there's a bit of a sea change coming.
Yeah, and I think the new US administration might be changing some of the perception of that. There's definitely a sense from people I speak to in the States where there might be some rolling back of some of those changes. But I think there's you got to look at the external drivers. If kind of the ransomware operators carried on just running unfettered, across everybody's systems, and that's a pretty big driver to get better security measures in place. If kind of the nation state actors and their intrusions, there's plenty of those last year. If there's more of that kind of stuff, then yes, government is going to get a little bit more animated, and regulators are going to be a bit more animated about what the kind of the level of regulation. I think there is a big difference though between regulations that are super prescriptive and regulations that are more kind of outcome focused or risk management focused. You look at GDPR, for example, which is, it's quite an outcome focused regulation, and it all then comes down to enforcement, and businesses take a view on the level of the risk they're taking against that regulation versus some regulations you've got in biomedical and kind of pharmaceutical. The example that is used a fair amount is access to pills bottles. They run tests, and if a 5-year-old takes more than 80% of 5-year-olds need to take more than 5 minutes to open one of those bottle caps, it's kind of deemed as acceptable. What's the equivalent of security for a system taking more than a set amount of time for somebody to get in? I don't know whether we'll go down that route, but it's like, it's how prescriptive, how all the way to that kind of outcome type of regulation is an interesting thing. The big problem, like I said, is if they get super prescriptive about controls, security controls and security standards, companies make such widely varying decisions around their technology strategies and their digital strategies. The likelihood of a standard being suitable, a controls-based standard being suitable for a large number of organizations is pretty slim. So you end up in the kind of the ISO type world of, you have mandatory clauses around having to do risk management, having to do planning and direction, and understand your external and internal context, all that kind of good stuff, and continuous improvement, and non-prescriptive on the controls. That's probably where I'm guessing if we do start to see more standards and more standards-driven compliance, that'll be kind of the direction of travel.
I love the idea of that pills bottle test being a metaphor for cybersecurity. Just a room full of white hats.
Just having a go. It'd be great.
Yeah. If you can get in less than 10 minutes, it's not secure.
Might make government work more attractive.
Yeah. I like that thinking. With that in mind, and that it's unlikely. It's not even unlikely, is it? It's impractical to think that there'll be centralized legislation that could be that specific. Do you have any sense? We've already talked about political uncertainty in other administrations. Like, do do you get any sense that there is any more impending changes that are going to directly affect you, or is it much more a case of carry on doing the right things, which it sounds evidently that you are, and it'll just be, evolutionary refinements that you'll have to do as these things come out?
Yeah, I think I'm not in the business of prediction, thank goodness. So predicting whether it could be around kind of responsibilities, having named officers responsible for security and them having the authority and the scope of role to be able to kind of fulfill that responsibility or accountability. It could be along those lines. It could be that we expand some of the really good thinking that happened. I thought it was excellent in financial services with the CBEST regime, where it was, kind of regulatory driven, threat intelligence led red teaming, because that's almost got a hint of chaos engineering around it, of having a pop at organisations, breaking a bank without breaking a bank. That feels like a very progressive approach from regulators, albeit it's got to be tempered by it could end up in a big kind of bureaucratic challenge and become extremely expensive, and you've always got to weigh the expense against the benefit. And one of the I spent a very short period of time in anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing software systems, and there's the evidence is not great on the success of the anti-money laundering regulation. You're dealing with criminality and threat groups, and the amount of money that's spent on compliance for those particular regulations versus the societal benefit. It's a little bit, the evidence I've seen is not brilliant. So we do need to be really careful about the risk reward of more regulation.
Yeah, I think apart from those really in the thick of it, the criminality side, the resources, the funds, the manpower that goes into it, the sophistication of it is easily underestimated if you aren't in the middle of it. Like the millions, if not billions, that they can throw at things probably does dwarf an awful lot of resources in the legitimate world that they have to protect themselves. It's phenomenal.
I agree, but I think the main thing that we miss, and there isn't a tremendous amount of research on, I'd love to see it if there is commoditization of attacks. Because that's the scale bit. That's the bit where there's a much larger number of victims because attackers have commoditized exposure discovery or kind of early stages of initial access. And we talk about kind of advanced persistent threats and that sort of thing, but the larger societal damage and business risk has got to be around those kind of scale areas. Not least because even the more sophisticated threat actors, they use the same initial access techniques because they use what works. So when we talk about kind of IT hygiene and kind of getting our controls more, better coverage and effectiveness of controls of the basics, that's really what we're talking about, is dealing with that really kind of rapidly commoditizing attack landscape, with all the malware as a service and ransomware as a service and all that sort of stuff. It's the data around that makes it a little bit less of a, what's the right way to put it? It's less of a lottery. We're always struggling with the likelihood of the risk equation in cybersecurity, and that just, it kind of pushes up the likelihood because so much of the attack chain is commoditizing and being automated.
Yeah, I mean, the horror stories go on and on. I'm sure it's a separate podcast, and it probably already exists as a podcast, those commoditized horror stories. To loop it back to what we were beginning to talk about at the top of the webinar with reporting, do you think that the increased assurance is because CISOs are being made to make the broader organization aware of those kind of threats? For instance, commoditization of attack, the repeat nature of it, the fact that anyone, anywhere with a connection to the dark web could go and buy an attack should they wish. Is that what's driving it, or do you feel like there's a more sophisticated understanding of cybersecurity and risk in a board, or is there something else that's driving the requirement for CISOs and security leaders to be reporting?
I mean, I personally, I've not experienced a board conversation where then they don't have a very good understanding of risk management. Now, the nuances of technology risk and making good risk decisions around technology risk is kind of a slightly different question. But quite often, you're tapping into a risk management muscle that's already there. You know, they're there because they do understand how to manage the upside and the downside of risk. I think where I've personally fallen down in the past is I've equated risk to kind of uncertainty and volatility, and saying, look, we just don't know, and it's just this kind of lottery around whether we get attacked or not. So let's just focus on doing these things. Whereas I think I've had more success more recently talking about downside risk management, because that's that's something that they understand. If you manage the downside, the upside will take care of itself, sort of thing. And actually, it's almost like with a balance to the eternal optimism of product leaders and product engineering who talk about kind of the upside of potential of technology. There's a downside. We've just got to talk about how do we get that downside risk managed to an appropriate level within risk appetite, or how the board wants it described. And
that's talking to them in terms that they can equate to contextually, and not dumbing it down, but you're creating a context that they can immediately relate to, right?
Exactly right. And it's providing them with data, as opposed to kind of lots of hand wavy subjective feelings about whether the business is doing a good or a bad job of implementing controls, or whatever the area of the risk of the information security management system you're most kind of concerned about.
Bringing it back to you mentioned your own personal experiences. Currently, how do you ready yourself for audits? I mean, I don't know how frequently you're audited, or if you are aware of a schedule, or if it's sporadic, or an internal audits, external audits. But how do you prepare, and how are you managing audit readiness as an organization?
So we do have kind of a combination of manual and kind of automated evidence collection and kind of audit compliance preparation. We do have regular internal and external audits. So yeah, we use that to inform our information security management system, and then when we do have an external audit, we've kind of got the evidence ready to go. We do have a requirement to pay especially close attention to certain systems, because some of the systems we manage are critical national infrastructure. So we pay particularly close attention to the evidence collection and the audit trail around those. They tend to be slightly more on the kind of the physical asset side. The vast majority of our business, though, is fully digital. So we try to automate and continuously monitor as much of that as possible.
So, right, that makes a lot of sense. So, in which case, because they're so regular, are you're continually monitoring and ready to report on control effectiveness remediation efforts to auditors?
I wouldn't say that we're ready at a moment's notice. It does take a fair amount of planning and preparation. So
quite resource heavy.
and it will depend on the area of the information security management system that's being audited, or the control type, or the system type, as to kind of, as I say, whether it's a periodic thing or something that's more continuous.
And excuse my ignorance on this, but the internal audit parameters versus the external audit parameters, do they vary hugely in the sense that they become two completely separate bodies of work with some crossover, or are you able to align or work, ask internal auditors to be contextually or parallel to what the external auditors are going to be?
Yeah, I think that comes back to that relationship with enterprise risk that that quite often manages kind of internal audit. So we do try and line things up. We kind of have discussion around the areas that would benefit most from an internal audit, to kind of give us some deeper insights into different parts of our environments. So yeah, that's very much I see the two very much as complementary.
Yeah. So moving it on then to reporting and managing your team resource, how do you set up a team for success when you're facing more internal and external pressures? A reason I bring it up is in the SLPR, 72% of security leaders feel that they could stop more breaches if they could spend less time reporting, which sounds borderline glib. But I wondered what your take is on that stat.
I guess because at the moment we're able to come at it from a risk reduction perspective. The very glib way of putting it is, outside of financial services, you tend to have fewer external opinions on how to do security. So we're able to drive our risk reduction agenda according to the data that we see, and the internal data that we see, in our own expertise, rather than having it's an external bodies dictating what our priorities and our sequencing is. So I think that probably kind of gives you the answer that we're able to prioritize the things that we think will actually make the biggest difference to risk reduction. Now, I do think when I talked about those three layers, the more strategic information security management system, and treating it as a management system, not a set of documents or policies and standards, but genuinely a system that should operate as a kind of a feedback loop to find control gaps, and kind of talk about the control coverage or control effectiveness, and have all of the kind of continuous improvement thing as a feedback loop. That is the opportunity to really think more holistically and think more about the business as a system, and where the problems might lie. And one of the things that I know has come up before is toxic combinations, and toxic combinations and missing controls. That's a real opportunity to take a look at the business and say, look, the security team, and you look at a bunch of incidents, more times than not, the security team will have identified the control gaps, or the kind of the ineffective controls, but they have often either done it as a silo, and so it won't have made its way to a kind of a critical risk, or they'll have done it without that kind of context of how it could be exploited by an attacker. And so it's kind of only when those missing controls or kind of poorly performing controls interact in that kind of toxic combination, and then you get a threat actor as like an accelerant. That's when you see the kind of the big damaging incidents, and that's when you make your way into the papers. So I think that's the value of thinking more holistically on that kind of overall control monitoring, and looking across the piece, rather than individual systems and individual exposures.
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense, and it probably brings me to the next question, which is, with that kind of system and that holistic mindset in mind, how do you split the work within your team and colleagues on reporting? Are people dedicated to it? Are they mindful that a portion of their week is required, or a portion of their month, etc.? That's the first part of the question. The second half of the question would be, approximately how much time do you think you actually spend reporting? Because even that holistic mindset, we know doing it in silos and ticking the box would probably be quicker, but your mindset is more thorough and more to the betterment of the organization you work for. So does that make it more labor intensive for you?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer, because we try and put as much of that information into decision-making processes as possible. So rather than just kind of turning up at a management meeting once a month or once a quarter, or going to the board and presenting a bunch of slides, what we try to do is get it into the business intelligence dashboards, or the kind of the technology reporting that our CTO gets, so they can see it as, for example, defects. They've got a lot of reporting, a lot of observability around defects in the systems that our customers are spotting. Well, if we put security or security vulnerabilities in there, or misconfigurations, now they are defects to the extent that an attacker is really can just be a customer that we don't want. So if you kind of mix it in with that kind of reporting, it's difficult to say how much of our, the split of time, because actually quite a lot of our role is around signal generation and transmitting signals, making sure those signals are kind of received in a way that they're understood and they've got the context to do something about it, and they're being prioritized appropriately. So from one perspective, you could say 80% of what we do is reporting, but it's really kind of engineering feedback loops. So we're it's kind of control theory, all of that kind of stuff. We're engineering control systems to kind of help the business make better decisions. Now, there is an awful lot of work that we also do to build secure by default patterns and bits of code and infrastructure. So there's that element of security, of deploying things that people can then just reuse over and over again, knowing that security of kind of either assured it, or we built it to be secure. But an awful lot of what we're doing is those kind of feedback loops, and so yeah, I don't draw the line at reporting perhaps as distinctly as just kind of the PowerPoints that go to the boards and all that sort of stuff.
It sounds like the lines are blurred, right? There's an awful lot of overlap, especially in your approach. I suspect with the way you approach it, it's naturally one begets the other. But do you think that handling that, speaking more broadly, not necessarily just for your organization, but handling these requirements, we've talked about legislation, compliance, audits, reporting, do you think that it can be pointed as a resourcing challenge for security leaders, or is it a tooling challenge? I.e., if you had the right tools, does that take the pressure off of resource? However, to have the right tools, you need to have the right people trained. Like, if you were going to give advice, or you were going to comment more broadly on these challenges coming down the line to any organization, do you think it's a resourcing or a tooling issue?
So I'll borrow a saying from the Google's Office of the CISO folks. They talk about OOT, organization, operations, technology, kind of in that order. And I think that's a super useful way of looking at it. So have you got the organizational setup where people really understand their accountability and responsibilities, and do they genuinely feel accountable for the systems that they're building and administering? Then have you got the operational processes, and that's really around understanding the system of work. So if we go out and buy a separate tool, and all engineering work's being managed in Jira, and we buy this separate tool and expect people to interact with this separate tool, it's just not going to work. So you've got to integrate the whole feedback loop and all the amplification around the exposure management and the problems that we're finding into their day-to-day system of work. So whether that's Jira or whether it's kind of the developer environments or CI/CD pipelines, whatever it is, you've got that integrated view, and that's kind of it gets back to that kind of level 2 that I was talking about. When you get to kind of the more strategic planning and perhaps the collection of evidence for audits and the spotting where the kind of the big control gaps might be or the opportunities for control improvement might be, I think that's the opportunity for some of the more modern tools to really kind of step up and help in that kind of building an information security management system, as opposed to the ISMS just being a collection of policies and statements. But again, it's got to fit into where the work actually gets done in the business. And if the work gets done in Jira or kind of other workflows, it's got to tightly integrate with that.
Well, with all of that, would this be any kind of security webinar if we didn't bring up AI? I'd be cast out of the cyber marketing fraternity if I didn't at least mention it once. Shame on me. But given everything that we spoke about in terms of the increased demands and how you're tackling it personally, more broadly, what thoughts do you have on AI? I was particularly interested about your mention of the compound risk, the toxic combinations of various vulnerabilities. There's been a lot of talk about whether AI would actually exacerbate that, but I was wondering whether you saw opportunities in AI to address these challenges that we've mentioned.
I think there's no doubt there's loads of opportunities. I mean, I mess about with some of the AI tooling that we've got internally to generate, run across 100 different open source threat reports and tell me, what are the TTPs that are kind of most prevalent in 2024, and therefore, does that inform our the prioritization around control improvements? And you can do that with one prompt, and you've got to run some expert judgment over the output. You've still got to understand the kind of the rationale behind it, but the assistance that it gives you in those kind of analyzing large volumes of information and then getting you started, fantastic. Similarly with looking at some of that security decision making and strategic decision making across large organizations generating a lot of data, there's no doubt that kind of LLMs are going to be really handy in kind of being assistants and kind of AI agents acting as part of the security team. I think is, that's probably going to be the marketing buzz for 2025, but I suspect there's going to be an awful lot of companies that are actually getting value from that.
And on the flip side, do you see issues? I think we're all seeing hesitation. I don't know, up to your point, I think everybody can see the value in it, but there's definitely a reticence to broadly adopt AI in what we're doing in this industry. Do you foresee any issues in that sense?
Yeah, I think the issues have been really well documented and really well articulated in, there's a whole bunch of frameworks. OWASP they've got an AI framework. There's or LLM one. There's those. There all seem to be. There's a lot of really good information about how to put some guardrails around it and do this stuff in a considered way. But yeah, I mean, it's the same as any other technology, that the opportunities for exploitation, the kind of the classic one of not having a technical issue with the tooling, but there being business logic one, and exploitation of that and prompt injection, all those kind of things are, they're all things that we need to think about when we're deploying this stuff. But again, it comes back to, like I said, just understand the downside. Like, there's upside of technology, just spend some time thinking and mitigating the downside, and I think that's the grown-up approach to it.
and one that, as we've said before, I think the board resonates with it easiest. Like, I think that's the bit they can really get their head around.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks for all of those insights. Really appreciate it. And thank you everybody else for watching and joining us. Hope you join us on the next one.
Thank you, Keith.